So I know it's another video on Sahitye Khun, but it will have all the revision in it. The summary, not summary, but thoda chota sa reading of Sahitye Khun by Purnachandra Bosu, because I have a few more videos planned, my study planned. Okay, so Purnachandra Bosu begins Sahitye Khun by grounding his argument in classical Indian poetics. He reminds us that rhetoricians have divided poetry into two. Okay, one is Shobhokabbo, one that is heard and read, and Drishyakabbo, one that is seen and performed. While Shobhokabbo ends in reading or listening, Drishyakabbo is transformed into living action through performance. Hence, it is also called Rupak. So, Drishyakabbor arek naam hoche Rupak. If in English, we'll call it Rupaka. Rupaka, poetry embodied in form diche. Drawing on Viswanta's dictum, Vakyam Rasatmakam Kavyam, Bose asserts that poetry is speech imbued with rasa, and that which does not generate delight, and that which does not generate delight in the mind of Sahridaya cannot be considered true poetry. A word gulo important, drawing upon Viswanta, Visvan, Viswanantha, Viswanatha, Viswan. Okay, Aliva. Viswanatha, Visvanatha. Okay, Viswanatha's dictum, Vakyam Rasatam Kavyam. Vakyam Rasatam Kavyam. Bose asserts that poetry is speech imbued with rasa, and that which does not generate delight in the heart of Sahridaya, the sensitive cultivator, reader or spectator, Sahridaya, Sahrdaya, Sahridaya, cannot be considered true poetry. Okay. Rasa, Bose explains, arises when permanent emotions such as karuna are nourished by appropriate causes and becomes pleasurable. Rosh kake bole? Rosh bolche রস তখন উৎপন্ন হচ্ছে যখন পার্মানেন্ট ইমোশন যেমন করুণা নার্চার হচ্ছে বাই অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট, ঠিক কজ দিয়ে অ্যাপ্রোপ্রিয়েট হচ্ছে, আলটিমেটলি প্লেজার দিচ্ছে, যে বা আমার করুণা রসটা ভালো করে নারিশ হয়েছে, রাইট, becomes pleasurable. So Rasa Bose explains arises when permanent emotions such as karuna are nourished by appropriate causes and become pleasurable. The body of poetry must therefore be structured so as to yield a definite aesthetic effect, that is istartha. রসের কথা জেনে নিলাম। সেকেন্ডলি বলছে যে একটা কবিতার দেহ এমনি করেই স্ট্রাকচার করা উচিত যাতে একটা ডেফিনেট অ্যাস্থেটিক এফেক্ট পৌঁছাতে পারে। ধরো তুমি রাগের কবিতা লিখছো কিন্তু মানুষ হাসছে, তো ইট ফেলস, রাইট। ইস্তার্থা, আ মিনিং অ্যাপ্রিহেন্সিবল টু দ্য সেন্সিটিভ মাইন্ড, এবং এমন একটা মানে উৎপন্ন করছে যেটা এই যে সহৃদয় ব্যক্তি সেন্সিটিভ মাইন্ড অ্যাপ্রিহেন্ড করতে পারছে। ওকে, so while Shobhokabbo enjoys relative freedom because it remains confined to imagination, you can only hear it and read it. Drishyakabbo is bound by stricter rules since imagined actions are physically enacted before an audience. What may be tolerable or even pleasurable in reading, like war, bloodshed, violent conflict, can become disturbing or repellent when enacted on stage. Hence, dramatists must carefully exclude whatever obstructs aesthetic delight. কারণ এই যে প্রথমেই বললো কাব্যর একটাই এম, সেটা হচ্ছে আনন্দ, মানে রস উৎপন্ন করা, অ্যাস্থেটিক ডিলাইট না, ডিলাইট উৎপন্ন করার। তো ধরো তুমি যুদ্ধের ব্যাপারে পড়ছো, হয়তো পড়তে তোমার খুব মজা লাগছে কারণ তুমি ইমাজিন করছো, ইট ইজ ইয়োর ইমাজিনেশন। এবার সেই ইমাজিনেশনটাকে তুমি যখন তোমার চোখের সামনে দেখবে, ইট উইল নট প্রডিউস দ্য সেম অ্যামাউন্ট অফ খুশি, অ্যান্ড হেন্স ইট শুড বি স্টপড, ইট শুড নট বি শোন। এই পার্টটা আমরা আরেকবার পড়বো। Rasa, Bose explains, arises when permanent emotions such as karuna are nourished by appropriate causes and become pleasurable. Rasa, Bose explains, arises when permanent emotions such as karuna are nourished by appropriate causes and become pleasurable. The body of poetry must therefore be structured so as to yield a definite aesthetic effect. Like istartha, a meaning apprehensible to the sensitive mind. While Shobhakabbo enjoys relative freedom because it remains confined to imagination, Drishyakabbo is bound by stricter rules since imagined actions are physically enacted before an audience. Where what may be tolerable or even pleasurable in reading wars, bloodshed, violent conflicts can become disturbing or repellent when enacted on stage. Hence, dramatists must carefully exclude whatever obstructs aesthetic delight. Hence, dramatists must exclude whatever obstructs aesthetic delight. Okay. Now, Viswathanam. See, we are forgetting the name. Viswanatha. Viswanatha's Vakyam Rasatmakam Vakyam Rasatmakam Kavyam all okay, Vakyam Rasatmakam Kavyam Vakyam Rasatmakam Kavyam. We'll test it at the end. Okay, so citing the Sahitye Darpan, Bose lists actions traditionally avoided in war. মানে আমরা সংস্কৃতে যেগুলো করি না বা অ্যাভয়েড করা হয়, ঠিক আছে? সো সাইটিং দ্য সাহিত্য দর্পণ, কিলিং, war, political upheaval, marriage, eating, curses, renunciation, death, sexual act, cutting of teeth or nails, shameful bodily acts, sleeping, drinking, bathing, and sieges. Among these, killing is empathetically forbidden. খারাপ লাগছে দেখতে. Because enacted murder produces not pleasure but extreme agitation. করুণা রসকে নার্চার করছে না, প্লেজার উৎপন্ন করছে না, ঠিক আছে? Killing is emphatically আমার কিছু তো একটা হয়েছে, দেখুন আমি এমপ্যাথিক বলছিলাম এতক্ষণ ধরে। Emphatically মানে in a forceful way, ঠিক আছে? Is forcefully forbidden, empathetically na, because enacted murder produces not pleasure but extreme agitation. Instead of rosh, it generates trembling, rage, and even the impulse toward violence among spectators. প্লেটোর কথা বেসিক্যালি, যে ট্র্যাজেডি দেখলে ওই আর কি ক্যাথারসিস তো কিছু হচ্ছে না, ট্রেম্বলিং হচ্ছে, রেজ হচ্ছে, ইভেন ভায়োলেন্ট impulse towards violence among spectators. A sensitive audience, Bose argues, cannot calmly endure the sight of flesh and blood murder enacted before their eyes. And a Sahitya Vyakti, mentally sensitive people, educated people, aware people can't endure the sight of flesh and blood murder enacted before their eyes. So we know this, we'll just go through one part. Among these, killing is emphatically forbidden because enacted murder produces not pleasure but extreme agitation. Instead of rasa, it generates rage, trembling, and even the impulse of violence among spectators. Okay, next we'll go to demonstrate this. এবার এই ওর বেসিক্যালি ওর কথাগুলোকে ভিত্তি দেওয়ার জন্য Bose turns to Shakespeare's Othello and quotes the scene of Desdemona's murder. The crucial point is that the audience knows Desdemona to be entirely innocent. Her foolish and deluded husband murders her unjustly. And this sight provokes uncontrollable anger rather than compassion. Bose insists that no truly humane Hindu or guided by Hindu social and religious ideals can tolerate wife murder. Even if a wife were sinful, abandonment is permitted, murder is not. When an innocent wife is killed, the act contaminates the mind and there is sin even in witnessing it. Public staging of such scenes, therefore, is wholly contrary to Hindu ethics and dramatic ideals. Once again, to demonstrate, Bose turns over to Shakespeare's Othello and quotes the scene of Desdemona's murder. The crucial point is that the audience knows Desdemona to be completely innocent, to be entirely innocent. আবার আমার চশমা কিছু লেগে গেছে, আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি না। আমার সঙ্গে এরকম হয়। Okay. Her foolish and deluded husband murders her unjustly, and this provokes uncontrollable anger rather than compassion. Bose insists that no truly human Hindu or guided by Hindu social and religious ideals can tolerate wife murder. Even if a wife were sinful, abandonment is permitted, murder is not. When an innocent wife is killed, the act contaminates the mind and there is sin even in witnessing it. Public staging of such scenes, therefore, is wholly contrary to Hindu ethics and dramatic ideals. To Hindu ethics and dramatic ideals. Hindu ethic against a dramatic idea against it. Okay. From here, Bose makes a larger cultural claim. সাহিত্য দর্পণ যেখান থেকে এগুলো পড়ছিল বা সংস্কৃত ড্রামা fully sanctioned by Hindu religion and taste never accommodates what European calls tragedy. The genre of tragedy finds no place within the Dasharupaka because it violates both aesthetic decorum and moral order. দুটোই aesthetic decorum কি একটা specific গোলের দিকে পৌঁছানো, এই করুণা রসটাকে এসব করা, and moral order কোনো খুশি দিচ্ছে না, no delight. When tragedy has entered India, Bose asks pointedly, what mischief has it not produced? European dramatic ideals, he explains, originated in Greece and evolved according to European tastes, not religious restraint. কিন্তু এখানে religious restraint থেকে আসছে, ওখানে নয়. As European societies lacked ethical ideals comparable to those of Hinduism, their drama inevitably diverged towards cruelty. এখানে ওই যে বললাম restraint নেই, আমাদের restraint আছে. Comparable, ওদের ethical idea থেকে তো এগুলো আসেনি, কারণ ওদের lack of ethical ideals আছে. Comparable to those of Hinduism এ প্রচুর আছে, according to Purnachandra Bosu. So their drama inevitably diverged toward cruelty. From here, Bose makes a larger cultural claim. Sanskritic drama, fully sanctioned by Hindu religion and taste, can never accommodate what Europeans call tragedy. The genre of tragedy finds no place within the Dasharupaka because it violates both aesthetic decorum and moral order. Okay, so when tragedy has entered India, Bose asks pointedly, what mischief has it not produced? European dramatic ideals, he explains, originated in Greece and evolved according to European taste, not religious restraint. As European societies lacked ethical ideals compared to those of Hinduism, their drama inevitably diverged towards cruelty. Okay. Bose supports with claim, with a sweeping indictment of European history, the cruelty of Spartan laws, the persecution of Athenian patriots, the poisoning of Socrates, gladiatorial games, medieval bloodshed, the crusades, the Inquisition, witch hunts, sectarian massacres, colonial violence, and brutal penal systems. The long history of bloodshed, he argues, reveals a temperament that has not been softened by any means. Literature ফুটে ওঠে যেটা কোনো soft হয়নি. European tragedy is thus a natural outgrowth of a blood-loving culture, and its fascination with cruelty permeate its literature. খুব important. Bose supports this claim with the sweeping indictment of European history, the cruelty of Spartan laws, the persecution of Athenian patriots, poisoning of Socrates, gladiatorial games, and medieval bloodshed. The crusades, the medieval bloodshed, the crusades, the Inquisition, sectarian massacres, witch hunts, colonial violence, and brutal penal systems. This long history of bloodshed, he argues, reveals a temperament, এমন একটা behavior that has not softened by any means. The আলিকা ঘুম পাচ্ছে, 1 second, 10টা বাজে খালি. This long history of bloodshed, he argues, reveals a temperament that has not been softened by any means, European tragedy is thus a natural outgrowth of a blood-loving. European tragedy is therefore a natural outgrowth of a blood-loving culture, and its fascination with cruelty permeate its literature. Okay. Shakespeare, Bose concedes, is a genius, but a genius who is intoxicated with tragedy. His poetic excellence pours brilliance. এটাকে একটু ঠিক করতে হবে. His poetic excellence pours brilliance into a fundamentally flawed form. Tragedy. His poetic excellence pours brilliance into a fundamentally flawed form. Bose memorably remarks that readers drink poison through the golden pipe of Shakespeare's poetry. English education in colonial India has trained Indians to revere Shakespeare, bardolatry, while neglecting Kalidas, Vash, Banabhatto, and Bhababhuti. Viswanatha. Rasam Makyam Kavyam. Rasatam Makyam Kavyam. Vakyam Rasatam Makyam. Vakyam Rasatmakam. Vakyam Rasatmakyam Kavyam. Viswanatha. Okay, Shakespeare's poetry. English education in colonial India has trained Indians to revere Shakespeare while neglecting Kalidas, Vash, Banabhatto, Bhababhuti. Worse still, tragedy has moved from the stage into real life. Easy access to weapons and constant exposure to murder in literature dull moral horror and normalize violence. Easy access to weapons and constant exposure to murder in literature dull moral horror and normalizing violence. The real life e tumi jodi weapon pete thako, it will be okay. This particular line, easy access to weapons and constant exposure to murder in literature dull moral horror and normalize violence. I can understand the latter part. Constant exposure to murder in literature through tragedy, normalizing violence is okay. But how are people having easy access to weapons? This is what happens in revision also. At this point, Bose introduces a crucial comparative argument. Although ancient Aryan literature did not adopt the European tragic mode, it possessed its essential virtue, Karuna Rosh. মানে খালি কি ট্র্যাজেডি থেকে করুণা রস আসে? আগে যখন ট্র্যাজেডি চলতো না ইন্ডিয়ায়, তখনও কিন্তু ইন্ডিয়ান কাজ বাজে করুণা রস পাওয়া যেত, দ্যাট টু ইন অ্যাবান্ডেন্স। কোথার থেকে? সীতা, দময়ন্তী, দ্রৌপদী, শকুন্তলা and others evoke enduring sorrow without being brutally killed. মরতে হতো না to take out the Karuna Rosh. Valmiki's poetic removal of Sita, her ascent among divine grace, produces deeper, purer compassion than Desdemona's suffocation. Valmiki's poetic removal of Sita, her ascent amid divine grace, produces deeper, purer compassion than Desdemona's suffocation. Separation, exile, and unending sorrow sanctify these women and lodge them permanently in the human heart. Unending sorrow sanctify. Separation, exile, এই যে সীতা রাম এবার আর জীবনের মতো আলাদা হয়ে যাচ্ছে। Separation, exile, and unending sorrow sanctify these women and lodge them permanently in the human heart. Bose stresses that there is a fundamental difference between tears shed for separation and tears provoked by murder. Both stresses that there is a fundamental difference between tears shed for separation and for murder. The former deepens compassion, to the latter shocks and disgust. খুন কি করে করে দিলে? The distinction becomes sharper in Bose's critique of Macbeth. Here, murder dominates beginning, middle, and end. Duncan, Banquo, Macbeth himself fall in a continuous slaughter. Lady Macbeth's repentance is a mere drop of milk in a pot of poison, drowned in a river of blood. The same murderous excess marks Hamlet, Richard III, King Lear, Julius Caesar, and even Shakespearean comedies like The Merchant of Venice. Drawing drama into a slaughterhouse both insists destroys Russia. Drawing drama into a mindless slaughterhouse both insists destroys Russia. As Addison too observed, delight is staged butchery in the mark of barbarity. As Addison too observed, delight in staged butchery is the mark of barbarity. যে তুমি জেনে বুঝে বুচারি দেখাচ্ছ, দ্যাট ইজ দ্য হাইট অফ বারবারিটি. Murder does not fulfill ভয়ানক রসা. It collapses into bibhotsho, causing রসভঙ্গ. Hence Bose's blunt conclusion, butchery is not poetry. মারলে পোয়েট্রি হবে না. কেন? কারণ মার্ডার কোনো মানে তুমি যে বলছো ঠিক আছে করুণা রসা দিচ্ছে না, হয়তো ভয়ানক রসা দিচ্ছে না, সেটাও দিচ্ছে না. ঠিক আছে, does not fulfill the ভয়ানক রসা. It collapses into bibhotsho. Bibhotsho, causing রসভঙ্গ, Bibhatsa, causing রসভঙ্গ. Hence Bose's blunt conclusion, butchery is not poetry. Bose then refused Horace's claim that murder is acceptable if shown on stage. Stage দেখালে মাফ করবে, সেটা Horace বলছে. The mention of murder, he argues, forces the imagination to visualize it vividly, whether enacted or narrated. Murder shatters aesthetic harmony. Aesthetically যে হারমোনিটা নিয়ে ঘুরছিল ওটা ভেঙে দিল. Right? He argues the mere mention of murder, he argues, forces the imagination to visualize it vividly. Whether enacted or narrated, murder shatters aesthetic harmony. Nor does Bose accept the defense of inevitability, যেটা তো হওয়ারই ছিল. If a tragedy demands murder to function, the fault lies in the choice of subject matter, not in human nature. Subject তুমি ভুল চুজ করেছো, ওই জন্য আমরা এক্সপেক্ট করছি না বললে বলতাম না. If a tragedy demands murder to function, the fault lies in the choice of subject matter, not in human taste and a cultural pleasure to depicting the Moor as brutish. Both literature, poisonings and suicides, often confined to English texts, are now imitated in Indian households, eroding soul's fear, and answers them by returning to his original distinctions, such as killings in Shabboka, bone or drama, and they are subordinated to the grand moral purpose of dharma. In the Ramayana or just and Mahabharata, violence is submerged within a text's ethical framework, and that elevates the reader. In tragedy, by constant, the murder becomes principal event. So y'all have seen me dozing. I don't know what is wrong with me. Wake up, Aliba. This is a result of studying constantly. So in the conclusion sections, Bose warns that English tragic faults are being absorbed into Bengali literature. Poisonings and suicide, once confined to English texts, are now imitated in Indian households, eroding religious fear and moral restraint. He anticipates objections about violence. In Sanskrit epics and answers them by returning to his original distinction. Such killings occur in Shobhokabbo, not Drishyokabbo or Rupak, and they are subordinated to the grand moral purpose of dharma. And they are subordinated to the grand moral purpose of dharma. In the Ramayana and Mahabharata, violence is submerged within a vast violence টা কিন্তু ethical framework এর নিচে চুবে থাকে, submerged হয়ে থাকে. That elevates the reader. In tragedy, by contrast, murder becomes the principal event. is the colonial context of the. Bose was writing in 1890s when Shakespeare had been institutionalized. That is my water. Through colonial education and civic service syllabi. এটা আপনাদের জানা খুব দরকার কখন পূর্ণচন্দ্র বসু লিখছে এটা in the 1890s when Shakespeare had been institutionalized through colonial education and civil service syllabi as a marker of civilization. His critique of tragedy is therefore also a critique of colonial cultural hegemony, challenging the European claim to moral and aesthetic superiority. In this sense, Sahitye Khun anticipates later post-colonial debates by exposing how literary taste is shaped by power and how uncritical reverence for Western canon can distort indigenous aesthetic tradition. This was the revision of Sahitye Khun. I'll come back with more.